It would be good if offsets actually did what it said on the box and achieved no net loss, if that's what we're going to claim. So I want to align the science behind how an offset is designed and done and delivered with what we are promising people is being achieved.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore conventional wisdom in the field of biodiversity and its conservation. I'm your host, Andre Marder. At the end of the last episode, I said that in the next one, Peter Bridgewater would be discussing with me the utility of MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. Unfortunately, I had to delay our appointment due to a sore throat and some other challenges, so this will be delayed until probably next month. But anyway, on to today's episode. In days gone by, development of cities, infrastructure, agriculture, etc., happened without regard for the environment. And it was really the devastating effects of unimpeded development that led to the establishment and early growth of the environmental movement, broadly speaking. We've become much more efficient at using land and other resources since then, but development remains inevitable. In theory, biodiversity offsets cancel out the effect of development by conserving biodiversity elsewhere. But that's just theory. Biodiversity offsets are controversial for a number of reasons. On the other hand, it's likely that we're stuck with them as a tool to mitigate biodiversity loss. Joining me on episode 29 of the Case for Conservation podcast is ecologist at the University of Queensland, Martine Maron. For much of her career, Martine has been researching offsets and doing her best to make sure that they are properly implemented. In our discussion, she explains what they are, why we're stuck with them, and how to make the most of them. I began by asking Martine to define biodiversity offsets in a bit more detail.
Well, the idea of biodiversity offsetting is to compensate for a negative impact on biodiversity, like a threatened species or an ecosystem. And instead of just compensating by paying money, which doesn't make any difference really for that species or ecosystem, an offset is specifically a type of compensation that involves doing a beneficial biodiversity conservation action that actually creates a benefit or a gain for that same species or ecosystem that has been impacted. The impact might be from something like a housing development, replacing some habitat or something like that. Mm-hmm. The idea is that you do enough beneficial work for that same species or habitat type to completely counterbalance the impact so that you have this no net loss outcome, and sometimes a net gain outcome, sometimes aiming to do even more than just enough to counterbalance.
Mm-hmm. Is it always area-based? From what you've said now, it sounds like it's not necessarily an area-based thing, right? It could be an action rather than an actual demarcated piece of land or sea that's put aside.
Yeah, this is one of the really important things about offsetting. Very commonly policies speak in the language of area. People think about it in terms of, 1 hectare of impact and 1 hectare of protection. But offset exchanges aren't about area for area, or at least they shouldn't be just about area for area, because actually what you're exchanging is losses and gains. Mm-hmm. So obviously we don't gain areas, we gain something about the area. So if you're talking about habitat for a species, you might need to do some work that increases the quality of habitat for that species across a certain area to get some sort of an improvement. And it's only that improvement that is validly exchanged for the loss of habitat for that species somewhere else. So really, when we're thinking about offsets, I prefer to think about them as, a set of actions that brings about a change, a difference. And it's the difference that the offset action makes that's the relevant point.
Okay. Could you give it might be a good point to give an example or two?
A really simple example, I suppose. Here I am in Australia, in Queensland, and we have a very well-known species, the koala. Mm-hmm. It's an arboreal marsupial. It feeds on eucalyptus trees. Its habitat is being cleared at a really fast rate, and it's actually an endangered species now. One of the problems is that a lot of its habitat occurs in places where people do want to put housing estates. Mm-hmm. And to do that, a lot of trees that are habitat for koalas get cleared. One way that can be dealt with through offsetting, hypothetically, is to track that habitat that gets lost, the number of trees or the hectares of trees that are going to be bulldozed. And then as an offset, make sure that you replace, by replanting, for example, at least that many trees of the same type in an area that would actually create habitat for koalas where it doesn't currently exist.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really very neat and simple example of biodiversity offsetting. Usually, of course, it doesn't actually pan out quite so simple.
Mm-hmm. That example, correct me if I'm wrong, but that example sounds like it is pretty spatial, right? It is an area-based example.
You can do it both ways. It all depends what's the most appropriate way to measure the losses, the impacts for the species, and the gains. So, of course, any action has to be done in a place. So, yes, of course, area comes into it in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
For koalas, the Queensland government policy, for example, actually does count the trees in most cases. So it is about estimating the number of trees lost. And then the offset is a requirement for a certain number of mature habitat trees that have to be replaced in exchange.
Right.
So, yeah, in that case, I mean, obviously that works out to a certain area because different ecosystems have different appropriate densities of trees.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, in that case, it's about trees lost, trees gained. But very often you do actually see offsets talked about in terms of a loss of 10 hectares of habitat of a particular quality exchanged for management that might be done across, say, 50 hectares of habitat that's of a low quality to try to bring it up to a high quality. And that difference that you make is the gain.
Okay. From what I can remember about biodiversity offsets, looking back sort of 20 years when I knew anything about them, which wasn't very much, I had heard that they were fairly controversial, at least in the South African context, and they were doing quite a lot of work at the South African National Biodiversity Institute on offsets. Is that still the case? And if so, why are they controversial?
Yeah, they still are controversial. If anything, they're probably more controversial because they're more widely used. And unfortunately, they also now have failures racked up right across the globe. So the reason for their controversy, well, there are actually many reasons. So there are people who have philosophical objections to the very idea of exchanging losses and gains of nature. It's seen as, an approach that essentially unitizes nature, oversimplifies it, or even worse, commodifies it, and, devalues its intrinsic value. Because when I gave that example before about the koalas whose habitat is lost, they don't move to this new site. That's not how it works. Those koalas, they're gone, or their territories are anyway. The koalas, the individuals that will benefit from the offset, they're different koalas probably yet to be born.
Right.
So you are really exchanging things that some people consider, that it's just not appropriate to exchange. So there's a fundamental sort of argument against it. But in practical terms, offsetting just tends to be implemented really, really poorly. Often schemes are designed badly. So you wouldn't even expect them to achieve that no net loss outcome that I said is the ultimate goal. Or they're designed well, but they're just implemented really badly. And in a lot of cases, nobody follows up, so we don't even know. So there's concern about the promises that are made when a damaging development project goes ahead and biodiversity is lost, and you hear it's okay, it'll all be offset. People don't trust that. And often that's sort of for good reason.
Right. And as you say, the more failures that are broadcast and made known, the more difficult it is to live up to a reputation that needs to be lived up to, I guess. But are there also examples where it's worked well that have kind of helped to further the cause?
Well, I think that there are individual offsets that are probably achieving the goal of offsets of no net loss. There are individual examples that are pretty robust and have been designed really carefully with an eye on the net outcome they are meant to achieve. I wouldn't be able to point to perhaps one whole scheme or policy where you could say, yes, the way that's been rolled out is just fantastic. I suspect there may well be some good schemes, but they're so poorly documented and those successes aren't so widely shared. Right. So I think that in some cases, offsetting well is actually possible. In a lot of cases, we try to do offsetting for things that are basically not really offsettable. And that is another part of the problem.
Is there, I mean, in Australia, for example, is there any kind of sector or, I mean, any kind of realm in which offsetting is something which is just done as a matter of course? For example, as part of an environmental impact assessment, outcome or anything like that. Has it become mainstreamed in any way?
Yeah, it is. It is. Offsetting is almost an automatic outcome in most impacts that are referred for a full environmental assessment under Australia's national biodiversity conservation laws. Mm-hmm. There's a national policy. This is also the case in many of the states of Australia mm-hmm. as well. They also have their own policies that are sort of complementary to the national policies when they're implemented. So they maybe tackle, state significant biodiversity. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's very routine. So the mining industry, urban development, infrastructure, these are all industries that very often end up causing damage to biodiversity. And if that damage is deemed to be significant, usually something that impacts a threatened species or a threatened ecosystem, mm-hmm. then an offset is required in line with the appropriate policy. Yeah, it's quite routine.
Right. And is it kind of, especially considering that it's sort of routine, very often when things are routine, people can become so used to it that they get lazy in implementing it. Do you think that that's maybe part of the, I mean, I guess my question is, has the concept been misused a bit by those who are using it in a routine manner and kind of know their way around, to find the easiest way out and maybe not implement them as well as they should be implemented, and thereby adding to the sometimes bad reputation of offsets?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there certainly are proponents of development, consultants who are very familiar with how to manipulate the calculations around offsetting to make it look like the offset is going to do a really good job. But when I look at the way those calculations are done, I can see errors immediately in most cases. So I do worry a lot about that. And I worry also about the capacity, for regulators who are meant to be checking in on this. It's a really complex area, so you really need a lot of expertise. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the case of Australia, we have nearly 2,000 different threatened matters that might hypothetically trigger a need for an offset. That's a lot of diverse expertise that people would need to be able to assess whether the calculations that are being done for a particular species, an impact on a particular species, are actually making sense, whether they are passing the common sense test.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of really poor offsets actually get approved and relied upon when they were never going to work.
And I guess that's, my sort of simplistic view of offsets was an area-based one. And I guess something which is entirely area-based, if you have to offset a hectare of mining with a hectare of forest or, something as straightforward as that, then it's relatively easy to monitor, right? But as you've explained, that's not how it works.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the classic sort of standard or best practice way of thinking about offsetting, sort of what I've described there. But I think in your case, you're familiar with the South African approach, and actually the South African approach is a little bit different. And some might argue that it perhaps doesn't meet the strict definition of biodiversity offsetting, but is another form of compensation, which is not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's actually a quite sophisticated approach. So the difference in South Africa is that instead of trying to achieve a certain amount of benefit to exchange for an equivalent loss, there's been work done to establish the extent of each ecosystem type that you want to retain, that you don't want to lose. Mm. And so they've actually calculated area-based ratios so that for each hectare of loss of one of these vegetation types, there's a certain amount of area that you just need to protect and not lose. Mm-hmm. And the idea of that is that when everything is either developed or protected, you haven't breached your target for retention of that vegetation type. So actually, it's a really sensible and intuitive way to do it. That's what you do when you're okay with the idea that you're going to actually draw down the biodiversity that's left still further, but you just don't want to draw it down too far.
Yeah.
So it's more like what we would call a target-based ecological compensation approach.
Yeah, and I know that South Africa is very ecosystem mapping oriented. They have very detailed ecosystem maps, especially in areas where there is incredible diversity in ecosystems. Within a very small area, you get a huge variety, and some of them are really tiny, and as a result, they're regarded as very sort of high quality in an offset sense, you know.
That's right. And the South African approach has drawn on really excellent conservation planning expertise in that country and really good quality data, and has based those targets on things like species area curves and so on. So it's actually a more scientifically based approach than you typically come across, to be honest.
And your job, Martine, you mentioned that sort of you come in at a certain stage in the process. So are you consulted in the course of environmental impact assessments? Is that more or less where you provide your expertise?
Unfortunately, I tend to come in after the assessment is done. So I was part of a group of people who back in 2012 helped develop the calculation approach that Australia uses to work out whether a proposed offset is adequate, is enough to compensate for a particular loss. It's a really open-ended calculator, so it gives you the logical structure for how to do that calculation, but it doesn't give you the data because it's very species-specific, situation-specific. Often what happens is that there might be a challenge to what has been proposed by a proponent for an offset. So I might be brought in to give sort of an expert opinion after that work has been done, and that's where I've often noticed a lot of problems in the way that calculation approach has actually been applied.
Right. And so difficult to change anything when everyone's kind of invested in the process already, right? The developers in particular, you know, to tell them sort of later on that something needs to be reversed is just so much more difficult than if it had been possible to be involved in the planning process.
Yeah, a really big problem here in Australia, and this is something that our National Audit Office has pointed out, is that I think the calculation approach and the policy are actually very good. Well, I would say that, but I think they make sense. But they haven't really been followed and used in the way they ought to for such a long time. There are sort of these sort of precedents, and proponents expect to be able to have a lighter obligation because someone else got a lighter obligation. Yeah. And that does make it really difficult to try to retrain users of this approach to get it back up to standard, because it looks like there's some unfairness, even though it's just trying to return to how things ought to have been done all along.
Right. Another question I wanted to ask is, I guess all my questions are kind of a little bit area-based, because I had this, paradigm that offsets were completely area-based. So I hope this makes sense. But I wanted to know what is to prevent an area that's been offset from being developed later on sometimes. So let's say you can sort of move away from the area-based thing, but just use that as a basis for the question. If an area is mined, for example, and the mining company then conserves a piece of land somewhere else, that mine might be destroyed for the next 100 years or more. But does that mean that the offset area is going to be protected for the same amount of time? Or is there a risk that, 50 years later, everyone's kind of forgotten about that?
Yeah, this is another really big problem with offsetting, and a big gaping gap between what is best practice and indeed what a lot of policies say and what actually happens. So absolutely, an offset really requires that the benefit that you create at the offset site is retained for the duration of the loss. Otherwise, they're not going to be equivalent. And that, as I say, that's written into Australia's offset policy. But in reality, the duration of contracts that secure the offset site and ensure that the management continues often are not in perpetuity. So they may only be, for example, 30 years or 20 years. And what will happen after that, we don't know. And even sites that are secured as offsets, they are sometimes then lost. It will be determined, for example, the example that you gave, a mining company, not that far from where I live, there was a case of this, where a site with an endangered ecosystem, semi-evergreen vine thicket, was cleared for the mine, and the offset was that they did a lot of really intensive revegetation of the species that make up that ecosystem on a site nearby that they weren't planning to mine. A little bit later on, commodity prices changed and suddenly it was profitable to mine that. So they sought an exemption and they were able to mine that offset site and just do another offset somewhere else again. So you also have this risk of offsets having to be offset and so on.
Okay. And then another thing which I can imagine must be very difficult is, again, sort of thinking from an area-based perspective, but I guess this can be extended as well, is how do you determine that an offset value is equivalent to the area that's been developed? And I'm thinking, again, from a South African perspective, where a lot depends on the particular ecosystem where the development is happening, right? Because it may be a very high biodiversity area, or an area of high endemism, for example, which is really difficult to replicate somewhere else, especially with these really tiny ecosystems, which have a very limited area.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are two elements to equivalence. One of them is equivalence of type, and the other one is equivalence of amount. So equivalence of type means that wherever it is you're doing the offset, it has to be the same type of biodiversity that's going to be benefited as what was lost. Mm-hmm. And that's where we do have to fall back on a coarse classification of nature. There's not really any way around it. So for species, we might say, okay, well, a koala is a koala. If you damage koala habitat, you have to recreate koala habitat or protect koala habitat. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, once you're talking about ecosystems, of course, we are used to making boundaries around ecosystem types, but we also know they are actually continua in real life. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly better quality versions, more intact versions of the same ecosystem, and poorer quality versions as well. Mm-hmm. So that is actually quite challenging. The other part of equivalence, though, is equivalence of amount. And that means that the gain has to be as large as the loss. That's where that calculator that I referred to comes in. Mm-hmm. So it assumes that you are talking about the same type of species or ecosystem, but it asks a series of questions to estimate the current condition, for example, of an ecosystem at the site and the area that it is over. Mm-hmm. And so the condition might be, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is completely pristine, exactly, the best quality example, and 1 is very, very degraded. And then it asks, what are the management actions you are actually going to do to bring about a change here? And that might be protection. So there may be some threats that you are going to be able to prevent happening. Mm-hmm. And it might also be active restoration and management to improve the condition over time. Mm-hmm. And so it asks for the difference between how large and intact will this site be in the future if you do the offset action versus if you do not do it and just business as usual carries on at that site. The difference between those two things has to be at least as large as the loss. Right. So those are the two elements of equivalence that we tend to consider.
And I guess it's very much site specific, right? Like how you actually apply the criteria. The example that you gave earlier on was number of trees for koalas, which is, you're obviously providing a as simple as possible example, but I guess there are many variables that need to be thrown into the calculation.
Yeah, that's it. So even with a very simple example like koalas, there are threats that we don't want to, for example, we don't want to lose some koala habitat in a place that's very safe for koalas and that they can survive and breed, and then put back some habitat in a place that's near busy roads where they might get hit by cars, or near areas where people have a lot of dogs in their backyards, because koalas also tend to get taken by dogs. So obviously there are other factors even in those simple cases that should be taken into account. But when you're talking about ecosystems or other species that have really complex habitat requirements, it's really difficult, and sometimes it's just impossible. There are some things that we just can't replace, such as, large old habitat trees. You lose them, that's it. There is no offset. Mm-hmm.
So what do you do, and maybe this is a silly question, but do you ever come across examples where a company just somehow has the right to chop down irreplaceable trees, for example? Do you then try to sort of find some equivalent, not equal, but equivalent way to compensate for that? So for example, again, looking at the area-based idea, if they chop down 100 hectares of very old trees, would you then maybe try to get 1,000 hectares of less ancient trees? Something, is it that kind of thing, or am I oversimplifying things?
Well, I mean, it is certainly the sort of thing that goes on, but it wouldn't actually achieve the outcome required because those trees are already there.
Right.
Now, hypothetically, you could say, and this is something that does happen quite commonly, but perhaps shouldn't, is that you might be able to say, okay, I'll find another area with some ancient trees, but this other area is under threat, and those trees might be cleared also if I don't create an offset out of this site and protect it. And so the gain comes from what we call averted loss in that case, or avoided loss, the prevention of the damage to the existing trees. So that sounds like it solves it, but it doesn't really, because in the case I'm talking about, where you've got a regulatory regime that is protecting particular ecosystems or species, for example, and requiring offsets where they're impacted, then that second site that you want to use as an offset, it should already be protected.
Right.
And if it were to be cleared, well, that would have to be offset.
Right.
So calling it an offset doesn't really make much of a difference. Just protecting it doesn't actually make a difference in net terms. So it does get very, very difficult. And I would just say that I don't think that ancient habitat elements that take a long time to form are actually fundamentally offsettable. They're just not. They'll just be a net loss if those trees go down.
So they should be non-negotiable, really.
Yeah, well, it depends what you want to be able to claim. So your choice, if you're going to impact something that is important but not able to be offset, well, you can either say, well, we won't lose it because we value it, or you can say, yep, we value the thing we're replacing it with more. But the important thing is to be transparent about that. You know, the public, for example, voters need to understand that this is not a rosy outcome for the environment. It's a trade-off, and the environment lost in this case.
Do you think, just overall, I mean, you know, we've spoken mostly about the challenges with offsets, but I'm kind of assuming that you are still, at least to some extent, a champion of offsets. I mean, do you think it's an important tool, or is it a lost cause?
I don't see myself as a champion of offsets.
Okay.
I see myself as doing the unfortunately necessary job of trying to improve the way that they are done. They're an instrument that it would be great not to have.
Right.
Given that we do have it, it would be good if offsets actually did what it said on the box and achieved no net loss, if that's what we're going to claim. So I want to align the science behind how an offset is designed and done and delivered with what we are promising people is being achieved.
Right.
I use we in a very general term there. I don't make any such promises. But if, for example, there is government policy that is promising a no net loss outcome, then I want to try to help make it as likely as possible that that will happen. And if that's not going to happen, I want it to be clear that that's not actually possible in this case. So I guess I'm more about transparency and feeding science into the process than championing either way.
Right. I guess my sort of point of view, you know, from a very much a non-expert point of view, is that you know, development is kind of inevitable, and so they're probably like, and this is very like big picture, broad thinking kind of way of looking at things. So it might be full of holes, but the way I see it, like, either we become more efficient at what we do, and we are, but, you know, even more efficient at what we do, so that we don't take up any more space than we're already taking up, or else we have to develop somewhere, right? And if we develop somewhere, then offset seems like the only possible solution, despite its flaws. I mean, would you agree with that statement, or?
Yeah, I would. That's typically how I introduce this if I'm giving a lecture on the topic, because, yeah, in reality, we do have these difficult trade-offs, and there are many parts of the world which are very important for biodiversity, but where human development is such an imperative. And the idea of simply saying, no, we can never have any further impacts on biodiversity whatsoever is problematic on so many levels. Whereas at the same time, we know that we've gone too far with biodiversity destruction.
Yeah.
So we are left with net outcomes approaches, with trying to generate benefits that more than counterbalance losses as our only resolution. The problem, I think, is that we tend to leap to offsets even in places where we could do more avoidance, we could minimise.
Right.
There are projects that go ahead every day that are in the wrong places, or they're unnecessary projects. And there are badly designed offsets, or offsets that are meant to achieve outcomes they can never achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right, fundamentally, even if everything was done perfectly, we would still end up with some of these sorts of trade-off situations. And in those cases, yeah, it makes sense to turn to offsets.
Right. But that makes a lot of sense. It should be a last resort, right?
That's right, yeah. I mean, basically because it's really, really hard to get right. If there are matters that are really easy to generate benefits for, we can do it. We've demonstrated it multiple times. Well, then that's fine. But biodiversity is really, really hard. It's really difficult to restore, to recreate complex ecosystems, for example.
Yeah.
So, offsetting has a really good place where we're talking about causing damage to biodiversity that isn't particularly complex, and maybe it's quite anthropogenically altered, and we know that we can, repair that damage. It's when it's applied to things that are essentially irreplaceable that it's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something. It's a good that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people, unless they are ecologists or conservationists, probably assume that any area can be restored to its previous state, just given enough time and the right soil conditions and species mix. But as you indicated now, that's almost impossible to get everything to go back to the way that it was before, even if it's surrounded by similar ecosystem, right? It can still be really, really difficult, and it's susceptible to invasive species and all the rest of it. Martine, I was wondering, do you know about the term OECM, Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measure? Does that have any relevance to offsets? A couple of things you said made me think, I wonder if this idea, maybe I should just explain quickly that for those who don't know, you nodded, but some people won't know that the idea of other effective area-based conservation measures are areas that are not formally protected, but they contribute to conservation. And the Convention on Biological Diversity, I'm having this discussion from CBD COP in Montreal right now, where that's one of the topics being discussed. And the hope is that by counting OECMs towards protection, countries will be able to reach a possible 30 by 30 target, which means 30% of land and sea conserved by the year 2030. So sorry for that little diversion, but are offsets a tool that can be used in conjunction with OECMs? I'm not sure exactly what my question is here, but I have a feeling there might be some relevance.
Yeah, there is potentially. I think there's a really uncomfortable interaction here, and there are a lot of risks around using offsets towards either OECMs or even protected areas. So, there are arguments that, one way to do offsetting might be for proponents of development to actually pay towards the acquisition of new formal protected areas as well. So whether we're talking about OECMs or stricter protected areas, if they come about as an offset for damage elsewhere, then that's a very different sort of benefit than if a government just decided to invest more in expanding a protected area, a state, or encouraging private landholders to manage land sympathetically and call that land an OECM. Because for every offset, the only reason it exists is that at least that much biodiversity has been destroyed somewhere else. Same type and amount of biodiversity is gone. It is a zero-sum game.
Right. At best, right?
Adding at best, absolutely. So adding offsets, places that are offsets, to the tally of protected area coverage, no matter what we call them, it's a real problem. It's not actually getting us anywhere. And this is one of the small bees I have buzzing about in my bonnet about the 30 by 30 target, because we have to be really clear what that target is meant to be doing. So calling a place a protected area doesn't change anything in and of itself. We need to understand, what is this meant to be contributing towards? And if what it's meant to be contributing towards is, improving biodiversity, increasing, reducing deforestation, these sorts of changes that we want those protected areas, OECMs, to achieve, then, that's quite a different thing than allowing offsets to count towards that total. Now, how? And I've argued that these tallies should be kept separate, but how we can actually go about doing that, whether that level of detail is ever really going to be grappled with, particularly at the international level, I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. What about the oceans? Is offsetting something which is done there as well? And is it much simpler or more complex or pretty much the same?
Oh, great question. And you've probably been able to tell from my answers so far, I have a terrible bias because I'm a terrestrial ecologist.
Like me.
I'm also a bird person. And so I think about things in a particular way. So apologies to all the marine and freshwater folk listening, because look, yeah, the marine realm is different. And I would say it's mostly harder. It's mostly more difficult. Yeah, stuff doesn't stay put. There's no ownership, private. You can't go plant trees in it. It's not that simple. On the other hand, there are things that can be done if it's around, for example, water quality. So it may be about doing actions on land that actually contribute to improved water quality adjacent to that catchment. There's a lot of work going on around restoring things like mangroves and seagrasses and so on. Very challenging, but, very worthy and not completely impossible in every case. So, these are things that can be done. But, things like boat strikes of marine mammals, there's so many different types of impacts, and it's really challenging to quantify the benefit that a measure you take in the marine realm might have. But, I have colleagues who've done some great work on particular measures around things like, changes to fishing gear and so on. So there's potential, but it's really difficult, partly because of what you've been saying. You really take that area-based element out of it. It's not, you can't count hectares anymore.
Right. Actually, funnily enough, I was thinking in an area-based way, because particularly about the possibility of no-take zones. So if you sort of demarcate, even though it's difficult to see, right? It's sort of you can roughly demarcate and roughly police an area so that it's not fished at all. And then it has the benefit to the fishers who fish around there, as being a nursery for fish, which sort of produces fish that then migrate out of it. So I guess that would be the one area-based way that you could offset in the ocean, but probably only on the coastline, right?
Yeah, I suppose it's tricky once you start getting to thinking about fishery yields. Really, take quotas and things that contribute to that overall net outcome are perhaps actually more familiar to people working there. So measures that, improve the overall stock, rather than thinking about them in terms of one individual fisher takes this many fish, what action do they have to do to recreate that sort of fish somewhere else, to change to fish habitat? It tends not to be thought about that way, which makes sense, to manage the system more holistically. And so I guess that's something that's, that's more possible, and obviously has an extremely long history in the marine realm, whereas we don't tend to do that so much in the terrestrial realm.
Right. So overall, it sounds like offsets is kind of something that we're stuck with and we have to make the most of. But it also strikes me that, I'm a conservationist myself, and although I've been mostly stuck in the policy realm for the last 10 or 15 years, I'm kind of surprised by how little I now know a lot more about offsets, having spoken to you for the last hour, but I knew very little before that. And I think generally people, even in conservation, are not that aware of it. So I guess one thing that would help a lot is if people were a bit more aware of what offsets are and what they should be, right? And this whole idea that they should be a last resort after all other conservation measures are taken into account.
I think that's right. I think there's been a really growing awareness, though, over the past sort of 10, 15 years.
Oh, yeah?
Certainly the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, which was led by Kerry Carter for 15 years, with a really great team of people, raised a lot of awareness around what best practice is. A group of people helped to establish, the first international standard policy on offsets, the IUCN Biodiversity Offset Policy, and those initiatives, I think, were really important for building that sort of the basis, the best practice standard for comparison. And so more and more people are now, I think, equipped to actually take a look at what, their local government or an industry or a business that they're familiar with is doing, and say, hang on a minute, that's not like for like, or that benefit isn't as large as the loss, or that's not going to be protected in perpetuity. Where really is the gain? So I actually do hear a lot more pushback about bad offsetting from the NGO sector over the past sort of 5, even 10 years than 15 or 20 years ago. Certainly, I think the awareness is continuing to grow.
Next time, as mentioned in the intro, I'll be talking with Peter Bridgewater, another Australian professor who is a veteran of multilateral environmental negotiations. We'll be interrogating the utility of multilateral environmental agreements and asking some questions that might seem quite obvious, but are actually really seldom asked. Peter is a real mine of information on this topic with decades of experience, as well as being a really entertaining interlocutor. I recommend listening in even if you didn't think that this was a topic that interested you.